Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201 for our class for Thursday, the 5th of December, our very last class before the final examination. So, let me talk a little bit about the final and also the final course project. So, next week on Thursday, which would be the 12th of December, at 6 p.m., I am going to be posting your final on our Moodle site because, as you know, we are a online rather than a face-to-face class. In a face-to-face class, you would have had 2 or 3 hours to work on the final. So in an online class, I'm going to give you a 24-hour period to work on the final. I don't expect you to spend 24 hours writing that final. You should spend approximately 2 to 3 hours. And that final will be due exactly 24 hours later on, believe it or not, 12/13, which is Friday the 13th. Not that I deliberately planned it that way, but sometimes the universe will provide. And I think that's a particularly convenient date considering the subject matter of our class. So that will be due 24 hours later on Friday the 13th at 6 p.m. And your final project is going to be due Thursday on the 12th by 6 p.m. so that you can walk into the final, not have to worry about your final project. But certainly you can hand in final projects early. And in terms of where we are in the semester, this is the film that perhaps is the highlight, and it certainly was the inspiration, which is Get Out. And you certainly have a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time if it turns out that you wanted to devote your final project to Get Out. And certainly the final exam will give you an opportunity to write on any of the films. So the final exam will be an essay exam. It'll be open book, open notes. So it's not a question of memorization. And as you can tell from our discussion forum responses, I tend to favor questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, that instead require reasoning and analysis. The best way to prepare for the final is to have done all of the readings for the class that were assigned, to have watched all of the films that were assigned. Obviously, you've been writing journals over the course of the semester. Your very last journal will be on Get Out. You can hand it in at any point up until next Thursday. And I encourage you to hand in your journals earlier rather than later for obvious reasons. What we've been doing is basically submitting in discussion forum responses 48 hours after our quote class meeting unquote on Thursday evenings, and the same with our journals. But on the 12th, which is our very last class, is the last day that I would accept any assignments, except for your final exam, which is due 24 hours later. And for the final exam, I will give you choice. There'll be a series of essay questions. I don't expect the writing to be as developed or polished as something you might do in a final project, but I do expect that you can put together some of the arguments that we've been talking about or some of the themes that we've been talking about over the course of the semester in your argument, and also that you've got a beginning and a middle and an end at the very least in terms of the construction of your essay. So in terms of Get Out, it's a mix of horror and comedy by Jordan Peele, who is known initially for his comedy, and he's gone off into horror. Give you an idea of the kind of power that he has now. He's working on a new film, and he refuses to disclose its title, or at least the last I read, he refuses to disclose its title. It's just known as the new film by Jordan Peele. And I would not at all be surprised if that's the way it's released, so that no one knows its title until it actually comes out. And I certainly would be there in line waiting to see that film. So, in just a few films, he started with Get Out, and then he moved to the film Us, which is a terrific film. I really encourage you to see that. And then he had a film called Nope, and had a lot of fun with that title when individuals would ask him what the film Nope was about when he was filming it. He'd say, Nope, I won't talk about it. So, and now he's at the film where we don't even have a Nope as the title. We have nothing, just the new film by Jordan Peele. And he went to Sarah Lawrence College and majored in, of all things, puppetry. And then he left to form a comedy group and do comedy improv. Very skilled doing that. And now he's a very respected horror director, which was his dream since he was a teenager, 13. My suspicion is if he continues to produce and direct horror films at the pace he's been doing, because he's still young, he might be up there along with some of the horror masters such as Hitchcock. This particular film, Get Out, is quite important historically. It is the first original screenplay to receive an Academy Award by a Black person. So, obviously, this particular film, if you haven't heard about it, has made quite the splash in the horror genre and also in terms of film history. His production company is called Monkey Paw Productions. And if you know anything about the short story, The Monkey's Paw, it's a great horror story, that ghost story in many respects, that actually we read in my Gothic literature class. The story is entitled Monkey's Paw. It's a short story written in 1902 by Jacobs. I highly recommend. And the film, and I'm going to give away some spoilers here. So if you have not seen the film, then I would recommend that you see the film and that you come back at minute 640, because at 640 I'm going to start talking about the film. We're at 640, so now I'm going to start talking about the film. We don't have a class, obviously, to talk about the film after this class because we'll be taking the final exam. So, in terms of the film, which I'm hopeful that you would have viewed at this particular point, notice how important the music is. In fact, that was one of the readings that I had us do about the importance of music in terms of setting tone. But the title track is entitled Listen to the Elders. The song is Swahili, which is an African language. The lyrics are basically trying to warn Chris about the difficulties that he's going to be encountering. Then we get the song Redbone by Childish Gambino, which says stay woke in the lyrics, which obviously is one of the messages that this film is trying to get out. There's a lot of puns with the Get Out title. And the film, or I should say the song, is about a woman breaking trust in relationship. And this is obviously the plot in Get Out. And we know that there's a lack of representation in horror films, so Jordan Peele is really reinventing the genre. And it's a commentary very clearly on 2010's racism. Jordan Peele talks about this himself, that in the 2010s we had the election already of Barack Obama, and the thought that perhaps America had now become anti-racist and colorblind, which we know, unfortunately, with hindsight, is anything but the truth. And he talks a little bit about, in his film, the history of slavery when he shows us modern slavery. And usually we talk about modern slavery from an economic perspective. But here we see how Jordan Peele is paying homage to some of the horror masters. There is very much a sense of some previous horror films, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where somebody's identity is taken over. In this instance, we see how ultimately the minds of Black individuals are being replaced with the minds of white people so that they could utilize Black bodies for their own benefit. And the pun of the title, Get Out, obviously Chris should get out, and he doesn't. And I was suggesting this is a film about getting out the message about modern racism and classism. If you see the Armitage House, it's obviously quite wealthy and privileged. And it also is a term that sometimes is used for disbelief, like get out. Like, I don't believe that. And of course, one might not believe that racism is still occurring. And in this particular film, we see that it is quite alive and well. The beginning of the film is where we see a Black man in a white suburb. Obviously, he's out of his element. We see how incredibly dangerous it is for him. Usually, we talk about how dangerous it is when a individual who is considered to be other is in a place where they are marginalized, and that's definitely the case with this particular character. And we see the photographer Chris. He is a photographer because he can see things that other people can't. Excuse me, I'm still suffering from this cold. He also is able to document things. Think about the importance of the cell phone during this time period and how it's become even more important to be able to document events, particularly for the Black community, because if you don't document, then there's a good chance that you're not going to be believed. In fact, even if you do document, there's a good chance of gaslighting and not being believed. So when we are introduced to the Armitages, we learn that the father is a collector. He's collecting treasures, and obviously both the father and Rose are collecting treasures. Note, for instance, little subtle clues like color imagery, such as the color of the cars, to reinforce the black and white imagery that's discussed in the film. Some of the music that's playing in the car when our initial character is kidnapped, the Run Rabbit Run. We see some foreshadowing when Chris at the beginning is cutting himself with some shaving cream. Chris also happens to be the name of the title character of The Exorcist. And of course, this idea of being possessed by another entity is inherent in the idea of the coagula experiment that is being conducted by the Armitage family. At the beginning, not only does Chris cut himself with white shaving cream, very symbolic from a color imagery perspective that something white is going to be hurting him. But we see Rose at the beginning in a bakery selecting sweets. The idea, this is how she thinks of Chris and other black men, that basically there's something to consume and they're there for her pleasure. We're told by the Armitage family early on that there's black mold in the basement, which is how black individuals are viewed by the family and by the people that the family interacts with, a kind of black mold. The idea of creating the perfect human, which is related to the idea of eugenics, combining physicality, the idea that blacks have superior physicality, with intellect, the idea that Caucasians have superior intellect. And that coagula experiment comes from the word coagulate, which is to clot or to transform. We learn about Chris's trauma as a child, that his mother was a hit and run victim. That'll be important later on when we see the ending of the film with Rose. Note that Chris is paralyzed by fear and is using TV to comfort himself. Again, I think another message that the marginalized, or those that are consumed by fear, rather than confronting their fears, oftentimes rely on television, or perhaps it's that television hypnotizes the masses so that we don't question the inequalities and the horrors that exist in our present society. When Chris is trying to escape, one of the things he does when he's in the basement and tied down is that he's able to utilize the cotton from the chair to plug up his ears. And of course, cotton is so important in terms of the history of slavery, where slaves were required to pick cotton. Notice how this image is subverted, why Chris using cotton in order to escape an impending slavery. The sunken place, lots of development and critique about how the sunken place is a symbol for marginalization and oppression for any of the disenfranchised, but especially the black community, that they basically are buried under those who have power and privilege. The poetic justice, and there is some poetic justice here, is that ultimately Rose dies alone on the street which is kind of how Chris's mother dies. And notice that at one point, Chris is strangling Rose. If you are, at the ending, if you are familiar with Shakespeare's play Othello, which happens to be about a black man and more who marries a white woman, and the discrimination that results, and the prejudice that results, and the pushback that results because of that. The very ending of the play, Othello is convinced of his wife's, Desdemona's, infidelity, and he strangles her in bed. And Jordan Peele, of course, would have been very familiar with that scene, to have Chris, a black man, strangling a white woman. But of course, we see that Chris stops because he has a level of morality that the Armitage family could never, ever have. The idea of a black person that's being trapped and controlled in a white person's mind or a white person's world is also another message that Jordan Peele is trying to get out. And note that the person who is interested in buying Chris's body in a scene that looks like a bingo scene, or if you wanted to think about it, almost like a slave auction, this man is colorblind, and I think that's a brilliant detail. That this man says that he doesn't see color, and again, a not so subtle commentary on people in our own society who say they're colorblind or that color doesn't matter, and whether they are deliberately acting that way or not, ultimately they are still imposing harm by engaging in a system that is racist and classist. Um, this theme of seeing, what do you see, what do you don't see, that's so important. Notice that Chris uses the flash in his camera in order to be able to stop the coagula experiment from some of the other individuals who have fallen victim to it. It's a flash of light. It's almost like an epiphany, an insight that occurs, if you will. But also this idea of the light allows individuals to be able to see. Again, this idea of black and white imagery. And the reinforcement of the power of the cell phone and being able to document things that would never have been able to have been documented previously. Now, this particular film had used an alternative ending, and Jordan Peele decided not to use it. And one of the things I'm going to ask you to do today is to watch that alternate ending. YouTube is a wonderful thing because it provides the alternate ending. And that's going to be your last attendance question for the class, which is going to be due on Saturday. Again, you can ask for an extension if you like. The very last day that I would accept would be, of course, next week, which is the date of our final examination. And your question is going to be whether or not you prefer the ending that was used in the film, or where it seems like Chris has been saved. But note that Chris is going to be returning to a society that is still filled with racism, overt and covert. So in some ways, there isn't any possibility of saving for Chris. The alternate ending is different. I won't give away spoilers. I'll have you watch it. And your attendance question is, which ending did you prefer and why? Again, in terms of looking at some of the symbolism, look at some of the outfit changes that occur over the course of the film. Rose at the very ending, for instance, looks like she's on a safari or a hunting expedition, wearing all khaki and holding a shotgun. Notice at the beginning of the film, there's a joke about what are they going to be on their lawns with shotguns to Chris, and that's exactly what ends up happening. Lots of animal imagery in this film. The idea that Chris is viewed as an animal. Lots of hunting imagery. Notice the deer heads on the wall. The idea that Chris's and blacks are a kind of prize. Notice the symbolism associated with lions, again, oftentimes hunted in the wild. And we see that through stuffed animals, for instance. And we get the answer in this film about what it's like to be black in the United States, because this is told through Chris's perspective. In effect, he's the character we're rooting for. It's constant and obvious and subtle racism, whether it is deliberate or unintentional. And the scene at the dinner party, I think, is absolutely brilliant, as Chris is signaled out constantly because of his ethnicity, with some incredible questions and responses about whether or not he has physicality in the bedroom, about whether or not he has physicality on a sports a context. We see that throughout. And this is constant. The idea that Chris isn't seen as an individual, he's merely seen for the color of his skin. So I think that this particular film is very deliberately a literary analysis in a way that perhaps some of the other films weren't necessarily as deliberate, though we've been applying analytical skills to those particular films. And in terms of thinking about today's reading, what I had assigned in addition to spooky sounds was the colors of fear. And I think that both are very much evidenced in the film, the use of sound, in this instance, soundtrack. But this is something we've talked about before. But certainly, color imagery. This entire film is about how we use color in order to justify racism and prejudice and inequality in our particular society. Now, if you wanted to look at the Nightmares book that I had assigned for us, there's a great filmography at the end. Lots more horror films that we could be talking about. And of course, we haven't really had much of a chance to talk about cross platforms. But notice how many horror films had their origin in novels, though sometimes the horror film inspired the novel, as we talked about with Halloween. Think about how radio programs, and certainly we're thinking about things like podcasts in our current time, but this goes all the way back to the radio plays of the 1930s and 40s that were associated with horror. Perhaps one of the best examples is Orson Welles' broadcast of War of the Worlds, which I talk about in my media and my media and popular culture class. Was a radio broadcast that basically seemed so real at the time. They had adapted War of the Worlds, which was a science fiction novel about aliens, Martians, invading the United States. That it was occurring, the radio play in real time, as if the invasion were actually happening. And it was so convincing that there were individuals who were listening to that radio broadcast, which was broadcast right at Halloween, and that was very deliberate. The radio broadcast was meant to scare people. People thought it was so real that they actually responded as if it was real, with traffic jams in the streets, phone lines being clogged, religious places being filled with individuals hoping to be saved. And actually, some people committed suicide, thinking that that would be the better fate than being enslaved by Martians. And it led to actually public hearings and ultimately to a law that's been put into place because Orson Welles, who produced and wrote and starred in the radio play, um, had given a disclaimer at the very beginning, and he knew when he was giving the disclaimer, many viewers wouldn't have been tuned in yet because there was a very popular radio show they probably would have been listening to, so they probably would have tuned in late. And there were no other disclaimers over the course of the radio show. So there is now a law in place that radio needs to announce its call titles and it needs to explain if we're listening to something fictional on a fairly regular basis through its program. And I think we talked a little bit about this with Blair Witch, because ultimately, with Blair Witch, individuals actually believed it was real. They didn't use radio, they used the internet. And it was as recently as perhaps a decade ago where there was a documentary on television about a megalodon, which is a prehistoric shark. And it was done, I believe, in the Discovery Channel. And that said, individuals who didn't hear the disclaimer at the beginning that it was fictional believed it was a real documentary. And I mention all of these because it's very easy to fool individuals. You know, we talk about fake news nowadays, but again, for the technology of the time, that would have been considered cutting edge radio, let's say. And this idea about how radio and television can deceive, um, and also how radio and TV can embrace horror. You know, many of you have talked about, for instance, Psycho is now examined in a television show. So you can see these cross platforms. And of course, there's a long tradition of video games influencing film. Sometimes film influences video games, but usually it's the other way around. Think about the Resident Evil series. So, a lot more to discuss in terms of horror. If you are interested in horror Gothic, you might be interested in my Gothic literature class, which I teach in the fall, very deliberately so because I want Halloween, and I teach that class online. As opposed to this class, which you've been taking online, I offer it in the spring on a face to face basis. If anybody wanted a face to face experience, that's on Thursday evening at 6 o'clock. That is no mistake in terms of when your final is due, because basically what I try to do in my online class is to duplicate as much as possible as what I would do in a face-to-face class, which is why I have our class videos posted by Thursday at 6. It's why your final exam will be available Thursday at 6. And normally you would be taking the final in a face-to-face situation Thursday at 6, but I'm giving you 24 hours in the online situation so that you're handing it in on Friday at 6. It just so happens to be Friday the 13th, which is a very happy coincidence. So, in terms of next week, I will be posting the final exam, and that will be the last date in which you can hand in any late assignments. So, and that also includes, of course, the last date that you can hand in your final project. So, for one last time, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, even though I've still got a bit of a cough from my cold. And we will continue on with the final exam next class. And I hope you enjoy the alternate ending for Get Out. Take care. Bye bye.